We are watching an unprecedented power grab in Washington, D.C. and on Wall Street right now, folks. What began with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank last week has now transitioned into one of the most twisted power grabs I've ever witnessed in Washington, D.C. The big banks are currently seizing control of every corner of the economy, and they're using the government to do it for them. The Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Department of Treasury are all now acting on behalf of the big banks to create a monopoly, and they are leaving people with no choice but to send all their money to the big banks or risk losing it. What's up, guys? I'm Nobody Special, and yesterday Janet Yellen was testifying in front of the Senate Finance Committee. This is Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma, and he's about to ask Janet Yellen some questions about the rural banks in his state and the recent rescue of Silicon Valley Bank. I'm going to give you my reaction to this and put it into layman's terms so you can understand just how twisted what's going on in the banking system is right now.
Start with some of the banking issues we're dealing with on it. Will the deposits in every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of their size, be fully insured now? Are they fully recovered? Every bank, every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of the size of the deposit, will they get the same treatment that SVBP just got or Signature Bank just got?
So under the law, at least until Thursday afternoon, any deposit at any bank in excess of $250,000 was not insured by the FDIC. In other words, if that bank failed and you had more than $250,000 in your account, you lost that money. That is until wealthy venture capitalists and tech firms in Silicon Valley were at risk of losing their money when Silicon Valley Bank failed. And so Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC all got together and decided to just throw out the Dodd-Frank Act, and they changed the law on a whim without any debate in Congress, without any legislation being passed, and they fully insured all of the deposits at Silicon Valley Bank. They decided that there was too much risk to the economy, and so the Fed would bail out everybody fully. And James Lankford is now asking, will the small banks in farm country in my state in Oklahoma, are they going to get the same treatment?
A bank only gets that treatment if a majority of the FDIC board, a supermajority of the Fed board, and I, in consultation with the president, determine that the failure to protect uninsured depositors would create systemic risk and significant economic and financial consequences.
So Janet Yellen's response was, no, your small little farm banks, sorry, we don't care about you. You're not big enough. That is only unless a supermajority at the FDIC gets together and decides your bank is big enough that we deem it important to bail out. Not just any majority, a supermajority, as if the majority hears, help, help, my bank is failing, and the majority runs into a phone booth and they rip open their shirt and there's an S underneath. This is no ordinary majority. This is a supermajority. And then, of course, Janet Yellen and the president get a say. So tech executives in Silicon Valley who tend to donate a certain way politically and have clout in Washington, D.C., they get bailed out. But if you have your money in a little old bank in Oklahoma and that bank fails, well, sorry, we just don't care about you.
Right. So what is your plan to keep large depositors from moving their funds out of community banks into the big banks? We have seen the mergers of banks over the past decade. I'm concerned you're about to accelerate that by encouraging anyone who has a large deposit in a community bank to say, we're not going to make you whole, but if you go to one of our preferred banks, we will make you whole at that point.
Now, that was a very important question because you have to understand what is the net effect of what the Treasury and the FDIC and the Fed has done. They have offered free insurance to customers at big banks while denying that same free insurance to customers at little banks. So what the government has done with the bailout of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank is they have created an incentive, free insurance, if you get your money out of the little banks and go put it in the big banks. So they've created conditions where if you're wealthy enough, if you have more than $250,000 in your account, it's almost reckless to leave that money at Senator Lankford's small Oklahoma banks instead of moving it over to the big banks where the Federal Reserve will guarantee those deposits. When you offer free insurance to the big guys and deny it to the little guys, what you're doing is you're putting the little guys out of business. They have created an uneven playing field, And Senator Lankford is starting to sniff this out. What they're going to do is they're going to put all the little banks out of business. They're going to accelerate the run on small regional banks. Janet Yellen is not fighting the bank run right now. Janet Yellen is the bank run. She's incentivizing the flight of capital out of small banks and into the big ones. This is a massive, massive transfer of power from small, rural, regional banks into the big Wall Street outfits. But just listen to Yellen's response to this question.
Look, I mean, that's certainly not something that we're encouraging.
That is happening right now.
That is happening because depositors are concerned about the bank failures that have happened. And
before I let her keep going here, understand, she knows she's cornered right now. She knows she's busted. Lankford just called her out on the conditions that she's created where she's putting the little banks out of business. So she knows there's no right answer here. So she's now going to dumb down her answer. She realizes anybody with half a brain is going to see through what she's saying. And so she is now marketing to people without half a brain, hoping to say something that maybe they'll understand and thus agree with her. What we're seeing right now in this answer is political maneuvering by Janet Yellen, who just got cornered by Senator Lankford and exposed for what she's trying to do, which is help Wall Street take over every last corner of the economy. Listen to how she squirms.
That have happened and whether or not other banks could also
it's happening because you're fully insured no matter what the amount is. If you're in a big bank, you're not fully insured if you're in a community bank.
Well, you're not fully insured. And
you were at Signature, and it just barely met that threshold. You were at Signature.
Well, we felt that there was a serious risk of contagion that could have brought down and triggered runs on many banks, and that's something, given that our judgment is that the banking system overall is safe and sound, depositors should have confidence in the system, and we took these actions.
So there's a special assessment that's been done on community banks in my state and all banks across the country. Was there any discussion that that special assessment would only apply to the larger banks, or was it always assumed the special assessment would cover every bank, including rural banks in my state?
So Yellen just said in no uncertain terms, those other banks are big enough for us to care. There's a risk to the economy. We only bail out the big banks. And she's just glossing over the fact that just stating that is creating bigger big banks. They're creating more too big to fail banks. By insuring the big banks and not insuring the little banks, the money is running away from the little banks and into the big one. And Senator Lankford is asking her, hey, has this been your plan all along?
I think I'm not certain what the rules are around that. That's for the FDIC to determine.
It has been reported publicly that SVB had a large number of Chinese investors that are there, including some that were companies directly connected to the Chinese Communist Party. Will those individuals, companies, entities, and investors that are Chinese investors be made whole based on assessments in my banks in Oklahoma? So what I'm asking is, will my banks in Oklahoma pay a special assessment to be able to make Chinese investors whole from Silicon Valley Bank?
So a little bit of background on this question. The funds from the FDIC, the Deposit Insurance Fund, are made up of fees that are charged to banks. All banks pay into the Deposit Insurance Fund, and therefore you, as a bank customer, you pay into it through fees charged to you at your bank. Well, the FDIC is raising the fees charged to the banks in order to finance this bailout. So Senator Lankford is saying, hey, people in my state at small rural banks, which you just told us are not getting the free insurance, they're being forced to pay these fees, and that money is going to bail out Silicon Valley Bank customers. Well, a lot of Silicon Valley Bank customers are wealthy Chinese communist businessmen who own chunks of these Silicon Valley tech firms. Surely money from customers at America's rural banks is not being used to bail out Chinese communists, right? Right?
Uninsured investors will be made whole in that bank, and I suppose that could include foreign depositors, but I don't believe there's any legal basis to discriminate among uninsured.
I get it, but I'm just.
So short answer, flyover country? Yup, you're paying for it. You, rural bank customers in Oklahoma, in Senator Langford's district, you're going to be paying through higher fees at your bank. You're going to be paying to make sure wealthy Chinese communist businessmen don't lose money. She can phrase this any way she wants. She can say there's no legal basis for discrimination. Okay, fine. But you know what? There's no legal basis for this bank bailout in the first place. Why are we even talking about this? The Dodd-Frank Act said bail-in was the law. The second it was time to bail in a big bank in Silicon Valley, people like Janet Yellen here threw out that law with no act of Congress, and nobody even stopped to say, hey, maybe you're not allowed to do this. And now she's saying, rural bank customers, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay to make Chinese Communist Party investors in Silicon Valley tech firms whole. It's against the law. We don't care because we got a supermajority together and deemed that that bank was big enough. And sorry, you're going to have to just pay for it.
Just saying my community banks are going to pay this additional fee. It is always fascinating to me as well, the conversation that taxpayers are being made whole in this, that taxpayers are not going to have any kind of consequence on this. I'm sure my bankers are going to be very excited to know they no longer pay taxes.
And Senator Langford gets one last little jab in here at the end of the clip, reminding Yellen what an absurd lie that it is, that the taxpayers are somehow not footing the bill for it, even though through a series of very well-crafted questions, Senator Langford just got Janet Yellen to admit that bank customers in Oklahoma will be sending their money to bail out wealthy Chinese investors in tech firms. Now, let's gloss over the thing about the Chinese investors real quick and go back to the net result of what Janet Yellen just said. And this was on national TV. Janet Yellen just told every wealthy bank customer in the country that we will give you free insurance on your bank deposits if you get that money out of small banks and put it in the big banks. And after watching all of these Silicon Valley bank companies wondering if they're going to be able to make payroll or if they were going out of business last week and over the weekend, you better bet that every wealthy individual and a lot of these companies across the country are right now yanking their funds from these regional banks and sending them over to JP Morgan and Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and all the big banks. So Janet Yellen is no longer fighting the bank run. Janet Yellen is not acting on behalf of the small banks. Janet Yellen is the bank run. She just added to it. She just made it worse. She has stated loudly and overtly to anybody who understands the acronyms enough to know what she's saying, it's time to get your money out of small banks and send it to the big banks where the government will protect it for free at the expense of anybody who's stupid enough to leave their money in the small banks. And understand what the net result of this is going to be. 10 to 15 massive banks will control all of the money. Everything. All of these banks that are members of the World Economic Forum, all of these banks with their ESG mandates and the ridiculous woke slop that has come out of the big Wall Street banks over the years, you have no choice but to send your money to them or just get out of the banks outright. And is it any surprise that we're seeing gold, silver, and Bitcoin rally right now as people are saying you have a choice. Send your money to the WEF banks or unbank yourself. If this policy is not changed and fast, within a few years, there will not be any of these regional banks left. Now, they're trying to slow it down with the rescue of First Republic yesterday and some of the bailouts of the smaller banks. They're trying to slowly demolish the big banks. But understand, folks, what's going on right now is a massive power grab by the big banks. They're using the Federal Reserve and the FDIC and the Department of Treasury to put their smaller competition out of business. The net result is going to be the big banks own everything. I don't ask this often, folks, but you need to share this video. People need to understand what is going on right now. There is still time to stop this, but if they're allowed to get control of all of the money, if all of these small banks are put out of business, there will be no stopping them because they will own every politician, assuming they don't already. I'm wondering, are there any politicians left? Is there anybody in D.C. left who will stand up and try to stop what's happening right now? Till next time, live small and dream big.